Kahlil, thank you so much for joining. I want to start somewhere small before we get to your journey. Let's talk about the TikTok ban. Thoughts, thoughts, concerns, what you think is behind it. You've had some interesting content about it, so that's kind of why I wanted to start. But tell me your initial thoughts.
I'm super against TikTok ban. I think it's a very concerning power grab from the government. I think it encroaches on the First Amendment rights of 170 million active users on TikTok in America alone. And I think that it's really important for not only young people to speak out against this, but for people who are like older, who are often outside the conversation, often have very stereotyped views about what happens on TikTok and about the content on TikTok. I think it's super important for them to also get involved in pushing against the ban because I think it foreshadows a huge concern that so many of us have, that the government is trying to silence speech that is not under their control. So the reason I say that, for context, for anyone who's not super privy to what's going on,
Yeah.
currently the United States government through Congress passed a bill in the House that would effectively ban TikTok under the supposed concerns of national security threats coming from China. However, what you might not see in the headlines is that number one, all of the TikTok user data for Americans is stored in Texas and is under the purview of an American company, Oracle. And you can read all about this. It's called Project Texas and something that TikTok announced around a year and a half ago. So it's already secure. Outside of that, the rationale that TikTok like uniquely deserves to be banned doesn't hold up, seeing as other companies, social media companies, both collect more data than TikTok, speaking about Twitter and Facebook, have the ability to sell our data to foreign countries like Russia and China, and have been proven to do so, which you can see with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which involved Facebook. So it seems like when you look deeper into the story and the headlines, and honestly the press release from the Congress people who support the ban, they're often saying that TikTok is a dominant news source, that there's so much misinformation about politics happening on TikTok. And we all know that the First Amendment is created because even when there is something bad, that you should counter the speech instead of censoring it. So what we're seeing is that the First Amendment is not being applied here, and that these Congress people are really scared of what the content on TikTok is, as opposed to the data being collected. And because they don't like the content, they're trying to suppress it.
Well, we've seen in hearings too that they're not, and nor would I expect people, right, of a certain age that aren't on the platform to know everything about the platform. But I've remembered when they've had execs from Meta and Twitter and other congressional hearings, them just not even understanding the basic tenets of what is going on in the platforms or what it's used for. I thought it was interesting when you looked at the vote, right? So again, as you contextualize, it's only passed through the House. If it were to pass through the Senate and then obviously get signed, there's a 165-day period for ByteDance to divest. Am I right?
Yes. And just to comment on that, so there's framed in the bill a divestiture period. However, there's a lot of research out there. There's great reporting by Taylor Lorenz of the Washington Post,
Yeah.
which says that this bill is an effective ban because, for many reasons. Number one, China has laws about exports and selling data, especially data that has sensitive government information, which would be the TikTok algorithm through ByteDance, to foreign companies. Of course, there's all the market concerns, and that anyone who has a company or is aware of how companies work knows that when you're negotiating with a timeline before a ban, there's no way to get a fair price, and that is just going to create a lot of economic issues. And of course, there's antitrust. So all the companies that would be able to buy TikTok, all the big tech companies often have social media branches. So there would be huge antitrust concerns that would also have to go through, and that would probably take longer than the timeline to sort out. So for a number of reasons, it does work as an effective ban. And in the press release, one of the Congress people who formulated this legislation said that it's a ban. Like, they outright said it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it feels like that. I mean, there are things that are designed to kind of make people. There are things designed both to calm the community down like that, and then also designed to kind of like terrify the crap out of people and inflame. You were kind of alluding to what would be my next question, but I'll still ask it, which was the precedent this could set if you start forcing companies to divest, right? Where could that lead? Where could that stop? That to me is the more interesting part. I mean, there's a lot of interesting parts, but the really interesting part is like, okay, well, if we have a rationale that you need to sell to, X, Y, or Z buyer, that's the problem too, right? Is that, yeah, if you have a limited amount of buyers and you have a limited timeline, you are not going to get a fair price.
Mm-mm. I think that's a concern, especially because the way the bill is written, it's under the guise that the American government can do this whenever a company is owned by a foreign adversary, has any ownership. Because once again, China does not own TikTok. China is the location of the company ByteDance that owns shares of TikTok, the American company. But like ByteDance has American owners in and of itself. So it's not like it's this Chinese entity, national entity. So I think a big question is, how does America even define foreign adversaries, right? Like, who gets to say who is a foreign adversary? I know Chinese Americans who have their parents and grandparents in China that don't consider the country as a foreign adversary. Although I guess in China's case, I'm not going to play dumb and not try to understand why that's the case. But there are other instances as well, where the United States government has allies, I would say, obviously, with like Israel and Palestine, that just very simply as an educational point, many Americans consider that country an adversary against the United States and United States interests. There's all sorts of changing tides when it comes to our relationship with other countries and different perspectives on who should and should not be considered a foreign adversary. Like at one point, Britain was, you know what I mean? So if this is legislation, we have to think 200 years ago, we were foreign adversaries with Britain and now we're not. So like 200 years from now, once again, if this is legislation and it's still there, who knows how it could be applied or misapplied and like how that could change the dynamics of our position globally, because we're almost instigating more competition by cutting off companies that at least for many people, arbitrarily are defined as foreign adversaries.
Yeah, I understand the argument that is made, but as you alluded to, Project Texas and where the data is, like you and I who live this and breathe this, we are not concerned. Are we privy to all information? No, I guess not. So I want to always couch that with saying, like, I don't know everything, but I think I know enough to know that, like, there's the one thing that has not been in this conversation is, I kind of equate this with tariffs. If you start to put a tariff on, it's a really easy thing to sell to people. It's like, hey, if we want people to buy American stuff, we're just going to put a big tariff on the international stuff. And they don't understand that, like, the negative unintended consequence and the easy, reaction is, yeah, okay, well, that's going to happen in return. Then everything's just going to be more expensive. So nothing gets accomplished. Fair point to say that if we make this move, that counter moves could be made by other countries with our social media companies and tech companies?
I would think counter moves can be made. I would say in China's case, they kind of already cut off everyone else.
Correct.
I will say, though, some people are saying, oh, China cut off America, so America needs to cut off China. But I think it counters the fundamental values of our country. The reason China cuts off content from other places largely is because of the content itself. They don't have the same free speech laws. People often say on China's version of TikTok, they have all educational material and they have only like mathematics for kids. And if we wanted that, then we can just be authoritarian through and through, right? That's the logic. That's the snowball effect of that sort of thinking. But like, we as Americans value, once again, free speech, having kids like have comedy, having the humanities involved, having these different political opinions. Like, we are a different culture, so we should not be emulating that. However, what I will say is, once again, in terms of instigation for a response, I don't necessarily think that China will ban more things from America because they're already pretty draconian there. But I do think, once again, within the global competition, there's other ways that China could retaliate or influence or use their soft power as a response to what America is doing, and a response to, once again, there's been agreements and there's been all sorts of geopolitical diplomacy around things like how we're going to handle Taiwan, the military presence in the South China Sea, and now we're getting like really deep into it. But I think that all of these things are just incrementally undermined by this big move against China in the United States.
Well, I think they're all related. I think I'm glad you brought up Taiwan and South China Sea. I think that's part of it too. But also what I'm kind of thinking is that it's not isolated to US and China. I think if we start to
Mm,
do, because you allude to, like, yes, China shuts down other things so that there isn't competition. If we are apparently looking like we are shutting down things so there isn't competition, do other countries that we would consider, to be power users of our products, do they change their minds? That's the one concern I might have, is if they start to view us as, authoritarian light. Yeah, even if a positive case is being made for why it's being done, you know.
yeah, I think a lot of countries would put us on their foreign adversary list. They
Mhm.
just don't have the power or like the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
necessary wherewithal to like ban things. But once again, I think to your point, in agreement with it, if this sort of precedent is set, we're on a lot of foreign adversary lists out there, and like if
Hmm.
people wanted to and they all coalesce around it, they could do the same thing to us for good reason, honestly.
Yeah, I think the older I've gotten, the more I've realized, like, how interconnected every single thing is, and
Hmm.
why it's very easy in any country to make a nationalist argument about certain things until you realize that, well, that's impossible. We don't live in a vacuum, and every action has a equal reaction, and so if you make this move, somebody else is going to make this move, and then your allies shift, your power shifts, and then there's a reason, good or bad, there's a reason why countries are involved in certain things. I would say, like, my cynical view of this is that this does not happen in an election year, because nobody wants to be the party of the one that got rid of TikTok. But then again, I look at the vote, and the vote is not. It's one of the very few votes I've seen in a long time that's not really contingent on party. It was kind of all over the map.
Yeah, it was weird. It was showing models of politics that I haven't really seen since like college. Like for example, the horseshoe theory, where they say that politics is not a nice line where the far right and the far left are on opposite
Hmm.
sides, but instead it's like a horseshoe where the moderates are in the middle, and then the far left and far right, they're not necessarily touching, but they loop back in and have their own similarities. And I think that that especially comes up when we're talking about
Oh,
like
yeah.
anti-establishmentarianism, just like general concerns about the power and the capitalism and the rich and the wealthy. General populism, I think, is also a shared value between the right and the left. So for that reason, you saw like Marjorie Taylor Greene voting the same way as Maxwell Frost, the first Gen Z
Hmm.
congressperson. But then also on the other side, like the bill was, I can't remember their names because they weren't super like iconic to me, but the two, the Republican and the Democrat who wrote the legislation, or at least advanced it. So I think for that reason, I think that there is a chance that this flips the table and flips the narrative around whether or not legislation gets passed during an election year. Because I think that both parties have an incentive to like take TikTok out of the equation.
Hmm.
Um, I think it helps
Yeah.
both of them because I mean I think the Republicans, there's generally just more young people on TikTok, and I think with Sans Israel Palestine, like without that, um, I think the Democrats would have not pushed this. I think that it was been way in their
Fair
interest
point.
to use TikTok as a means of getting elected. Biden has a TikTok for his campaign.
Hmm.
In 2020, Gen Z for Change, which was Gen Z for Biden, there was like Settle for Biden. There's a few other coalitions of young people who were literally side by side with like John Ossoff and like Raphael Warnock and Biden himself, getting these people elected, full stop, like not being a part of it, not influencing and helping, like they got these people elected, like full stop. And the
Hmm.
Democratic Party needs that. However, this year TikTok has been used as a platform for organizing against Biden's administration,
Yep.
specifically because of the qualms that young people have with the support for Israel's campaign against Gaza. And I think that what we saw in the primary with the hefty uncommitted vote in protest of
Hmm.
Biden got them really scared. So now both parties have no incentive to keep this app around. That's just causing chaos to each one of them.
Yeah, the more they can control, the more they or at least they can understand. They know. The interesting thing, right, is that the conventional wisdom always says, and this has been around since I was in high school, and the conventional wisdom has always said younger people are going to vote more Democratic. That's just it doesn't matter the generation, right? Whether it's been Gen X or millennials or Gen Z, they've always said that. But if you look at some of the polling data, It's very mixed. It's not as clear cut, and you're alluding to that. Israel Palestine is one of the reasons. There's an age gap. There are a few things that would make a voting bloc that would seem secure and safe and known not be known to the Democrats. So yeah, I don't think I don't think that's a guarantee. I think there are a lot of things that are kind of flipped on its head in this election.
Yeah, I think I'm in DC. I talk to DC people all the time. Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody. I have my own personal opinion who I think will win, but I'm not gonna like. There's no point in putting that out there into the universe. However, I will say that like all the DC policy wonk heads, all the former Obama administration kids, and the think tank people and all of that, like they all have no idea what's going on because there's so many variables that just have not been at play, that it's really up in the air.
Yeah,
Really,
and all the people I talk to in politics still, even if they try and denounce the idea that they live in echo chambers, they live in echo chambers. Everybody lives in an echo chamber. I mean, we all see a different version of the internet, so it's impossible not to. So I'll be fascinated when I hear, on either end, like an argument for or against, an argument for pessimism, an argument for optimism, and I'll be like, well, yeah, but what about this? Because it's not, it's not clear cut. And it will be very interesting to see. Yes, I will not throw out my opinion either. We'll do it in post, but
we'll write it in a little sheet of paper and like enclose it and then put it on the side and come back and have a podcast afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's listening to the podcast knows what my leaning on is. But what I'm curious is, when you were getting started, creating an account on TikTok and doing content, was there a distinct plan to be an edutainer? Was there a thought of just kind of what content you wanted to make? What were the early moments like?
So in this very room, I created my first TikTok in 2021. There's a window next to me in this direction, and I stood in front of it with the light. I didn't have a ring light like I have now.
Yeah,
and I made my first TikTok around, I want to say like noon on January 17th, 2021. And within 1 hour, that first TikTok got 1,300,000 views. So that's all to say. It's a little bit of bragging. I'm fine with that. But it's also all to say that I didn't really have a plan. I made my first TikTok out of passion. What it was about was it was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I saw that the FBI had wished Martin Luther King Jr. a happy birthday. And I was like, hold on. The FBI wishing Martin Luther King Jr. a happy birthday, unironically, has actually been one of my professors at Yale, Beverly Gage, who had written a book on J. Edgar Hoover, the former director of the FBI, and uncovered a plot, or at least rediscovered the plot, where the FBI had tried to get MLK to commit suicide through blackmail, because they had like all of his like tapes, and MLK was doing some stuff that he probably shouldn't have, but they had a record of that, and they tried to use that to blackmail him to commit suicide. So I made a video about that, and I made a video even before that one. The very first one was about like just generally how people remember MLK as like this beloved figure, like they whitewash his history, but he was an enemy of the state, and like arguably the state killed him. So I made a video about that whitewashing. I made a video specifically about the plot to kill him. And those both went super viral right off the bat. And then I think because of that pattern, and because it was just something that I was like so inclined to do, that it just came out of me, I realized that like there's a passion here for hidden history, for politics, for takes that people aren't talking about. And this is also coming after 2020, when there was more discussion about how America is a racist, white supremacist state. Yet even if I say that now, like assuming your audience is diverse, right? Like there's some people who I can say that and it's like, what are you talking about? You woke critical race theory psychopath. And I think unfortunately so much of the discourse around that true statement is revolved around like academia or sociology, or like big words like internalized bias or institutional structural racism, which I think have value. But I don't think the average person understands that or internalizes it or even remembers what they're learning if you teach it that way. However, I think through a story, a 1 minute story, and if you do like what I have right now, 400 of those stories of undeniable instances where like leaders, not just like random people on the street, leaders of the country did obviously horribly racist things in order to like set up the structure of the United States, well documented things that are like not even contested, then you can illustrate without like show don't tell, right? You can illustrate the issues of the country. And what I hope for, like, even though the stories are kind of sad, like also drive towards solutions and awareness. So that's always been my mission. That's kind of been my come up story, but it really just came out of passion.
Well, yeah, I mean, if anybody pushes back on that, it's because they are uncomfortable or, have discomfort with the idea that, the world isn't how they've been told it is or how they see it, right? It tells you a lot. Like I had an earlier episode with Teray, and we were talking about how, especially MLK, is viewed in 2D and not 3D anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, and I refer to it as the middle, the Midwest textbook version of Martin Luther King that I grew up with until I started, actually digging in deeper because, yeah, you realize that he was categorized as a terrorist. There was plenty. It was not, oh, we are uplifted by this one speech and everybody was instantly, happy about this and everything was fixed. Well, obviously not even close. No, I think that's the hard part, right? The hard part is like, it should be incumbent on people without the lived experience to try and seek that out and figure that out and understand that and be better about that. But I'm appreciative of what you're doing because it's incredibly valuable for people to every story that you think somebody might know. There's a ton of people who don't. And and they can learn from something that they can gain some perspective, right? I think the hardest part, like when you talk about privilege in this country, is that there's a ton of invisible privilege that people don't know they have, right? They'll push back if they're told, like with critical race theory or with privilege or anything, they'll push back and they'll be like, whoa, 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 no, no, no. I think one of the first things that will come out of their mouth is like, oh, I'm not racist or I'm not this or I'm not that. They'll get defensive. And it's like, well, it's not about that. It's just understanding, why things have been put in place, right? Mass incarceration, war on drugs. Was it a war on drugs? It's like, I remember, this will date myself, Kahlil, so this will be terrible for me. But I remember having DARE seminars at school, and then looking back on that and understanding, oh, okay, so that was the front facing part of an idea that was again designed to keep a population, at a lower level.
Yeah, it's so funny because when I was student body president at Yale, and as such, I had to have meetings with multiple leaders in the community. And one of these meetings, I was with the chief of police for Yale, and he told me, just like I think it was a part of the conversation, that the biggest drug dealing network in the entire city of New Haven, which is like a poor, majority Black and brown city that like is stereotyped to hell. But the biggest drug dealing network was the university and students within the university. And I know for myself, once again, I'm not going to incriminate myself. I don't, not in a Nancy Reagan way, but I don't do drugs.
Love that you said it that way. Yes.
But I know of many instances where drugs were done, were used, were sold, were exchanged that took place at the university.
Yeah.
And at the same time, this is not an issue. There's no police. There's no raids. There's no ruining these kids' future. There's no insane, like, stop and frisk policies. And it just shows, like, I already knew this was the case, but, like, it's just once you go through enough real life experiences where you see that disparity and that, like, that realization that laws really are not enforced in the same way. No. And that, like, on top of that, these are also the kids who went to the private schools and had, like, their whole life path spelled out for them since they were kids because they're so rich and elite. It just disillusions you to, like, all ideas around, like, meritocracy and the American dream and equality and the end of racism. And I think that, like, a part of my conviction just comes from, like, I've been in all the spaces. Like, people will say, work hard and you'll get there. And, like, they'll argue about that in the comments. And I'm like, I've largely been in like the spaces people are talking about, like the Ivy Leagues, the
Hmm.
top core. I was going to work at McKinsey and Company Consulting before I became a creator, which is like a big company that
Oh
works with
yeah.
all the big companies. And I've seen it all, and like it's super unimpressive, and it's also super corrupt. So like, what are we getting at here? And I feel like the point that I really want to emphasize is that like the world really is built off of facades and revisionism and lies, and like the more truth that we can tell, hopefully the more people can like wake up and become woke to the issues that exist.
Yeah, selective enforcement is absolutely real. You know,
Mhm.
that part is well documented and easily acknowledged. I mean, I'm curious, like, yeah, there's like a sliding door moment where you're doing a different thing, and you know you're at McKinsey or you're at a different place and you're consulting, right? Um, Ger- Anand Giroudis had a really good book, which I'm blanking on
Yeah,
the
I read
title.
it.
Yeah, McKinsey's at the beginning of it though, and he's talking
Yeah.
about it. You know, and I've been to a lot of conferences where even well-intentioned people, right, are talking about wanting to change the world and wanting to do this, but it all becomes just a cycle of jargon because we're all just kind of trying to, you know, it's like a Silicon Valley room of people trying to make themselves feel better and like, hey, we accomplished something. I'm like, but we didn't. You know, we haven't changed things. It's like, you know, I can look back to some examples post George Floyd and say some changes were made. But DeRay McKesson laid out a really easy 8 things everybody could do in every police department. And I'm not gonna check the stats, but I'm gonna assume that most police departments did not do that.
Hmm. Yeah, no, they didn't. And I mean, I think a part of it, like what Anand gets at, is that like this is deep politics, not deep politics, but like more political. But like a lot of these people are neoliberal,
Yeah.
which means that they believe that they can solve issues by throwing money at them. More or less, that's what it means. They can. I think like Zuckerberg had the big example. He like donated like 100 million to like a school district to better it, and it absolutely did nothing because like the issue was a lot more substantial and structural than just a lack of funding in a moment.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that that's like a part of it. Like I think that these people don't have a politic of what he says. Once again, he doesn't have they don't have a politic of like I need to lose something for these people to gain because they don't see what they're doing as bad. They don't see becoming a billionaire by like outsourcing your work to factories in XYZ country where the people are eating scraps and like dying as a bad thing. So then when they have to like they're trying to solve the issue of like malaria in that same country, they don't realize how they're causing the issue by like not giving people a livable wage and giving them access to healthcare. So I think that that like irony is lost among so many people who are in these like hyper capitalist spaces. I will say Gen Zers who are in these spaces are, at least in my opinion, like really doing a good job of calling it out and like not being super self like bigging up themselves. I think Greta Thunberg is probably like the quintessential
Sure.
example. Like she'll go to a place and she'll be like, you guys all suck. Like you guys are just here doing nothing. Thanks. And like even though like what she says might not necessarily have a direct impact either, I think breaking that veil, which is the work that I believe in,
Yeah.
is super important as a first step at the very least. And I think a lot of her work has like tangible impact, and she's an activist, right? So she's not going to be like the structural person who's creating all the new systems and sciences, technology. Also, she's very young, but she is doing her role. And I think many Gen Zers who are in these spaces with like these higher ups are doing their role of saying like, actually, you're not doing anything. You're harming the people more, and like these blind spots are only exacerbating the problems that you claim to want to solve.
Well, wonderfully put. I think the more things we can do to jar people, to get them out of their thought bubble, to get them out of their, you know, self-congratulatory, subset of close friends. Yes, it's incredibly. It's like well-intentioned donation without understanding what the barriers are is like well-intentioned but incredibly flawed. Like if you're not on the ground and you don't understand the full issue and you're just like, here's a check, right? It's like the same concept, which used to be companies that wanted to do purpose work or charitable work would say, oh, hey, we're just going to write a check, right, without feeling like they could do real impact. And now, at least progressively, we've gotten to the point where companies are a little more involved and they want to do a little bit more to be on the grassroots side of actually doing impact. Like we had Dove on, and Dove was like, yeah, not only are we doing a campaign, but we're actually getting legislation written to kind of help. That part is new. That part is helpful. But I think the more important question, and probably the biggest reason why I wanted to have you on this podcast, is just, well, I want to ask that question, and then I'm going to have a quick follow up after. But I want to just ask the question of like, how can more change be made and affected in a faster way? Just the easy questions. Sorry.
Well, let's start by not banning the platforms that people are using to make change.
Bingo.
That's number one. I would say, oof. Well, I think a big thing that people don't necessarily like tap into enough, maybe in my opinion at least, is like local issues and local change.
Yeah.
And I think that I honestly was exacerbated this, at least in my own small way, when I first started creating content. So let's say like there's some issue in the news. I'll tell you the story, right? So
Yeah.
there was an activist who went viral in 2020 at the Kansas City Police Department for giving a speech, calling them out, and like trying to work towards better policing legislation. And when I got my platform, I saw that there was another police shooting, like in a totally different part of the world. I think it was like California or something. And it was Minneapolis. It wasn't George Floyd, but it was another one in Brooklyn, Minneapolis. Dante Wright.
Yeah.
So I was like, I need to make a video about this, and like I can do my part, and I can reach out to this activist that went viral before. So I called her, and she told me, she was like, Kahlil, like I cannot work on this. Like, yes, there were headlines. Yes, there was a spike in my virality when my video came out, but like I'm still working on the Kansas City Police Department. Like I'm still doing legislation here. Like I'm still working. I'm still organizing. And I realized at that moment, like I think I have a platform where like national issues are important to me, and like I can speak out about them. But at the same time, I think everyone's biggest duty, in my opinion, should be their local communities and like things that they can affect at home. Because when you get, the further away you get from your longer community, the longer it takes for things to get done. So to answer your question specifically, like how to make things get done faster, start at home. Even if it's like even if we lose the presidency and like it's someone psycho who's the president, like there are ways of having mutual aid, like LA has community fridges and volunteers on Skid Row and other people who are affecting change, and not just waiting on like government policy to do so. So start at home is my advice.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like amplification is absolutely needed for people to point out things, shine a light on certain things, right? But amplification, the problem with the news cycle and the way content works is amplification moves to the next thing. So then it's left for, it's taking that amplification and turning it into something tangible. It's the same thing if you were talking to a creator. It's like, okay, you went viral with a couple things. Now what are you doing? Are you building a newsletter? Mm-hmm. Are you building a shop? What are you doing to monetize? Same thing with activism, right? Okay, well, now that there's attention here, what can we do? Who are the policymakers? How can we talk to them? Who can we have boots on the ground that are actually, working with this? How do we platform the people who are already definitely trying to make change in that community already, right? And so, those are the layers where that can get better. The comment I wanted to make, which is, Kahlil, I want to take this to a dark place 32 minutes in, which is you said something about Gen Z, which was that right now Gen Z is doing a much better job of, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but I don't disagree. Right now, Gen Z is doing a much better job of kind of owning things and wanting to be more reflective of themselves and wanting to learn more and wanting to, understand more and wanting to do more, right? The problem is that was also said about my generation of millennials at one point, and then we got into our 30s and we got cynical, and I don't like it. And I'm super hopeful that doesn't happen with Gen Z, right? I'm hopeful that like people don't lose that passion and that enthusiasm. But do you ever think about that?
I think about it. I think, in my opinion, like the big corruptor was like money.
Yeah.
Um, and as far as I understand it, every previous generation in United States history, like, yeah, when they're young, they might be progressive and then they get increasingly conservative over time. But it's
Yeah.
largely because of money and like the not wanting to pay more taxes if you don't have to, like
Hmm.
trying to get up the corporate ladder and caring less about the activists and social issues that you have to step on to make your way up. But I think that's also largely been because that has worked. Like the American dream,
Hmm.
and some for most people has been like in some capacity like true. Like you can work hard, you can get a house, you can get a job, money will pay off. Capitalism works, right? I
Yeah.
think that big incentive that people have to like leave movements and leave activism and leave advocacy doesn't work anymore. I think capitalism is failing in so many ways, especially wherever the American version of it is. Like as we talked about earlier, global power competition, like the rise of China alone in the
Hmm.
past, like what 3 4 decades, shows that there's a huge challenge to the idea that capitalism is like the best, most efficient market setup, right? Because China has like a central authority over their economics, and they've almost eradicated. I believe it's like they almost eradicated total poverty.
Hmm.
Um, and don't let the Congress use that as me like trying to be pro China for TikTok, but um, they have a bunch of issues. Obviously, like don't get me wrong, like this freedom of speech stuff that I would not ever get behind. But that's all to say that like there are big powers out there in the Middle East and China that are quote unquote our adversaries, but that are becoming at this at on par with
Hmm.
America. Like there's BRICS, right? So I think that this idea that American capitalism is where we should put all of our eggs in that basket, I don't think will fly with Gen Z because we've grown up just in a different time period where like money is
Yeah.
just not working the way that it should be. I think millennials were the last generation to believe in that, but then that kind of collapsed for them. So like I think there's a
Hmm.
little bit of maybe regret generationally, and like I see a lot of support from millennials, like saying, "Oh, like we love Gen Z, like quiet quitting, like setting
Hmm.
boundaries, mental health, like we love it." And I think that millennials were like the buffer generation of people who like had that fervor and maybe still believed in the hope. But I think
Yep.
Gen Z has a fervor, and like to make it more darker, we have no hope. So we have to make our own path, and I think that requires us to maintain a level of fervor around activism that previous generations just haven't had.
See, I love the point you make because, and I'm glad you took it there, which is that for so long, every generation has seen, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, there is an upward trend that says, okay, if you do this, you're going to get this, and then this is going to happen, and it will pay off for you. Because, yeah, you allude to, like, at one time, boomers were definitely a generation of progress and change, and still some are, but a lot of them are also not and running policy now. Yeah, for millennials, I mean, different challenges, but a lot of millennials graduated college thinking that upward trend was going to remain the same, and the financial crisis hits in 07. So there are a lot of factors. Yeah, I would like to think, and I mean, speaking on my own behalf, a huge fan of what Gen Z does, and of activism in general. It's one of the reasons why we have this podcast and why we want to platform these ideas. Um, yeah, I mean, I think you are apt to say that if you don't see the benefit, right? If you see, well, the wage gap keeps getting worse, and I'm doom scrolling Zillow because I can't afford a dang thing, right? And all of those factors come to play, so you don't see the benefit, then yeah, then you're going to challenge it more. And I think there's even some younger millennials that are in that boat too. That I mean, like I live in a very privileged position. But having seen enough and traveled this country enough to see other outcomes, I try my best, however flawed, to try and seek out and platform better ideas and better solutions. But yeah, I think you are correct to say that if you don't see the benefit of the system, you will continue to keep challenging the system. So that's the hope, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's exactly how I feel.
Yeah. Khalil, when I end these, I do something called keep it short. It's 3 questions. The questions are short. Your answers can be however long you'd like them to be. Are you ready?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. Question 1. Person on TikTok you think, other than yourself, because you can't answer that, person on TikTok you think is the most impactful? I know that's a toughie.
Did you have to answer short, or you say your questions are
No,
short?
no. My questions are short. Your answers we could go 7 minutes on this, but no, because it's like it's designed to be a tough question because there are a lot of really, really great people doing really great things on the platform. Also, just to and I'm filibustering here for you, but the other thing is that there are both very impactful things being done on the platform, but just sometimes it doesn't even need to be the person who's got millions and millions of followers. It's just the person who's creating content that's doing the most work.
Yeah, I'll shout out my friend Joelle. Their name is the Medical Mythbuster on TikTok, I believe, and they make content around like the disparities in healthcare that affect the Black community, and also just like general informational medical content. So like, if you have skin cancer and like you see a picture in a book that shows skin cancer, whether you're a doctor or a patient, it'll often be someone with white skin, and it'll only be the way that skin cancer presents in white skin. Whereas like if you're a darker skinned individual, like you don't even have sample images to even diagnose yourself. So he'll like excavate images and share them widely. And he's got messages that have said that like his work has saved people's lives, and that they've gone back and like talked to their doctor about something that they just thought was benign until they saw his video, and it turned out to be cancer or precancerous. So I think that's a big deal.
That's a huge deal. I'll give a quick shout out to Raquel Martin, Dr. Raquel Martin, who does a really good job of talking about societal issues of bias in a way, or microaggressions in a way that just anybody who doesn't think about that obviously then has privilege and doesn't have to deal with it, but it can easily, as we were having this conversation, like ways for people to easily contextualize something so that they get it. She does that in such a quick way. Question 2. What do you want to be doing 5 years from right now?
I want to own a media network and a creative agency. Media network will be something that I do where I present news and politics and history, but I also employ other creators to do the same thing, like guided, produced by the company that I have. And then the creative agency would just be the sales part of that, where we bring in companies that want to advertise products or services, or movies that want to advertise a new movie, like movie studios that want to advertise a new movie. And we'll produce like educational entertainment content. Entertainment is what I like to call it, for these clients. So I have a very clear vision on like where I want to be, but it consists of me owning and running those 2 companies.
Follow up, was that the idea before you started getting into TikTok, or has that evolved?
No, I just came up with that like a week ago, but it's been really solid ever since then. So
no, well, it sounds solid. Like I hear ideas a lot, and I can suss out whether or not they sound solid or not. But the other thing too is you're right to be considering the space because it is evolving so much that whenever a space is in flux, I think there are challenges, but there are also opportunities, because as the media players shift, that will open up lanes for people to pop in. Obviously places will pop out, right? And I think every time there's a technological shift, or even just a shift in venture capital funding, as we've seen with like BuzzFeed or Vice or other places, right, that rose to that first wave of media and didn't quite make it out. There are a lot of examples of sites that came around and media companies that came around in the late 2000s, and some really made it, some didn't. So there's some really interesting examples on kind of like how to duplicate that. Now we live in a different time where it's not about valuation; it's about how much you can kind of show now versus what you can do to access users. And basically the era of user acquisition, which lasted about 15 years, kind of changed. But this does create an interesting landscape, so that if you have a platform, you have a good message, and you have the ability to kind of mobilize the right team. The really interesting thing about that too is You don't need hundreds of people to make that happen anymore.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
find
like,
it
I think you can
fascinating.
make a really lean organization. It's often based on like a cult of personality because I think by the time AI really like makes its way around, a lot of the production and a lot of like the equipment and software and editors will like be written out of the equation one way or another.
Yeah.
And all that'll remain will be like the pseudo social attachment that people have to their favorite creators.
Yeah, hopefully emotional attachment and the contextualization of thought, right, can't be
Mhm.
duplicated, and so you and I personally can't be duplicated, and this conversation can't be duplicated. But
Yeah.
that's a conversation for another time. Khalil, third question. Your best unsolicited advice for people to create a platform on TikTok, impactful or not?
So Austin Leon has a book called Steal Like an Artist, and like the thesis
Mm.
of the book is that you're not supposed to start from like nothing. You find 10 places of inspiration, in this case 10 creators that like create the content that you want to create more or less, and
Hmm.
you just like copy and paste aspects of theirs to create your own. So don't start from scratch, start from people you admire.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, I mean, you said it very quickly, but it's market research, right? It's understanding what things people like. I think what's really so interesting about TikTok, right, is that algorithmic based social media, rather than having to just kind of continue to build a following, the kind of stuff where it's served to you, right? If you just understand what people's interests are, much like how Netflix realizes, like, okay, we have billions and billions of data points on what you watch, so now we know you're going to watch Love Is Blind and the spinoff of Love Is Blind. Like, we're going to keep creating content like that. Like, anytime somebody says they're like, oh, I wish Netflix would create something like this, I'm like, no, they're creating exactly what everybody wants. They know,
Mm-hmm.
and so the same thing can be true. It's like, it's not, it doesn't have to be completely calculated, but I agree with the notion of see what's working, see what people are gravitating toward, and if your stuff aligns with that, like, I'm not going to create something for lawn TikTok, even though I know it's a thing because I'm not passionate about it, right? But if your passion aligns with, there's an interest, then creating things to get the most eyeballs makes a lot of sense. I think
I
that's a good book
agree.
shout out. Yeah.
No, I agree.
Anything else you want to close with, or is that good?
Anything else I want to close with? I mean, of course, follow my content if you can. At Kahlil Greene, KAHLILGREENE on Instagram and TikTok. Also expanding to YouTube soon and maybe X. But I also have a really interestingly a large platform on LinkedIn. So if you want some more insights, follow me there. Outside of that, I think everyone should stay aware of what's happening with the TikTok ban and try to educate your family, or at least tell them about it, take it seriously, and just try to understand that TikTok is not just people dancing and pulling pranks on one another, but it actually is quite literally the most dominant news platform for Gen Z. There's hundreds of thousands of businesses that are using it every single day, and it has 170 million active users, which is over, I want to say, half the population of the United States. So this is a big deal, and it's not something that, even if you support it or like are ambivalent about it, it's not something that you should just let slip under the radar and go through without you being hyper aware of what's going on and like how it affects our democracy.
Yeah, and to bring it full circle, I think it's important to have those local conversations about it too, with one or two
Mm-hmm.
family members or a group of people that have maybe no clue what's going on with it or haven't paid attention. Because the more people are aware of it, the better we are, hopefully.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. This was great.
Thank you, Khalil.